So for the final project, we're going to be doing a study of a painting, a simplified study of a painting. And then from that simplified study, you will be making your own abstract painting. So, okay, so I know that may not sound completely clear to everybody. What I want, the reason I give this assignment is I want people to start fully understanding, or I guess we can't say fully understanding, but start to analyze and understand the way artists use composition in their paintings. So composition, who can define composition? Who can define? Go ahead.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. So who here can define composition? So we haven't really talked about composition, but composition, I think you could make the case, is the most important element in a painting in terms of successfully communicating the ideas of the painting. So what could I mean by that? Like when I say, or when I ask what composition is, what is that in any work of art really? But what is that when it comes to painting?
The elements that you put and you particularly place them in a way so it's pleasing to the eye.
I'm sorry?
You place them strategically to please the eye.
Yeah, so composition has to do with the arrangement of the elements in a painting. So in other words, where the different elements.
Somebody's waiting for you in the waiting room, sorry.
Okay. So composition has to do with how the artist places the different elements in a painting. So where within this rectangle did this artist place these different elements and why? So Diana said that composition is the way an artist arranges the elements in order to please the eye. And that is very often true. Very often composition is based on what the artist considers to be a pleasing arrangement of the parts. In other words, an arrangement of the parts that somehow seems ordered, it seems elegant, maybe we would say it seems beautiful. So the artist thinks that arrangement succeeds in that way for them, but then also we can assume the artist thinks that arrangement succeeds for viewers as well. I will say that it's not always true that an artist tries to please the eye. Sometimes artists, for various reasons, might do the exact opposite. But that's very often true. And if pleasing the eye implies a kind of order and a totality, in other words, a sense that all the parts of the picture work together with one another, that has certainly been a dominant approach to composition throughout history. So what, if we're talking about composition, what are some decisions this artist made when composing this painting? So this artist, first of all, is Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a 17th century Italian painter. And this is a painting of the Old Testament scene of Judith, and this is Judith right here. Oh no, this is Judith, excuse me. Judith beheading Holofernes. So this is Judith beheading Holofernes, and this is Judith's maidservant. So what are some decisions that we can point to that the artist made when composing this painting? and just before answering that, maybe this clarifies. The artist, after all, could have placed these figures in any number of different ways, right? So, like, she's chosen to show us Holofernes looking, chosen to show us this figure as if we're looking down at him, right? So we're looking down along the length of his body as that body moves backwards into space. She could have conceivably shown us Holofernes stretched out straight, right? So that's just one. So she very deliberately chose a certain placement of the figures. So what are some of those other elements she's chosen, and why did she choose to do that?
Probably to make her look powerful.
Yeah, the composition is arranged. That's
Yeah.
true, to make her look powerful. How?
Well, because normally a woman wouldn't, like, I guess, be considered as strong to, I mean, definitely in those days, to be able to do that to a man. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But you mean like so we don't see the full size of his body because of the
Like
placement of him?
her body is kind
yeah.
of above his in a sense.
Yep.
Theirs are.
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Devora?
Both Judith and I guess the servant, their bodies are both above the body of Holofernes. That's a visual component of that, like, I guess, kind of powerful dominating narrative.
Yeah, so that's true. So those are really important elements. So Judith and the maidservant are placed higher in the picture. And that's actually a common device, especially in traditional paintings, that figures who have more importance are placed higher in the picture. So that's a compositional decision. Or figures of greater power are placed higher in the picture. What else is going on?
The way they have the lighting, it's like all black in the background to kind of highlight the people.
Yeah, so that's a really important decision, that contrast of dark
Light
to
on their
light.
faces.
So that it both highlights the people, so there's a kind of graphic clarity to how the people are shown in the painting. It also does something else. What is it? So that the light against dark, how else does it help? Like, how else does it contribute to the way we see the bodies? So it emphasizes them, sort of graphically emphasizes them. But what else does it do?
I don't know if you could hear what I just said. My internet's kind of funny today. But the women both have light on their faces, whereas the light is kind of going from his.
Yeah, that's true. They're both strongly illuminated, and the light is diminished on Holofernes. And we could actually think of that in a number of ways. That again is emphasizing or placing importance on Judith and Holofernes. I mean, Judith and her maidservant. Holofernes could be seen, the darkness on his face, I guess could be seen as a way of representing the fact that he's dying. That he's kind of descending into darkness. What do people notice about the arrangement of the body parts in the painting?
I was gonna say that I think that the light is dispersed, like deliberately, like throughout. Like, so there's like the highlights on their bodies are kind of keeping our eye moving about that center of the composition, and I don't know. I guess I don't know. I feel like the lighting is just kind of like it's keeping our eye moving throughout that center of the composition because there are just certain parts of the body that she's highlighting.
Yeah, so the light is definitely emphasizing the center of the composition, right? So it's and it's keeping us there. And then also the light strikes the different elements in the painting so that we get a fan-like movement, right? A movement from here to here to here to here to here to here, and then back again. You know, there's a kind of maintenance of this motion, again, a kind of like fan-like motion of the different elements, and all of that movement, you know, whether it's that overall fan-like structure of the elements, or whether it's the way we follow almost like the spokes of a wheel. There's a series of spokes coming from that. The head of Holofernes is the hub. Or if we follow these kind of S-curves that are placed in these arcs and S-curves that are placed in the composition, all of those keep us coming back to the center, right? We come up here and then down. We come up here and then down. This brings us right down into the arm. Whoops. This arc brings us right down into the arm of the maidservant, which connects with the sword. So all of that, first of all, there's a density and a concentration of activity in here in the way the light's used. But also all of that activity brings us right back to the center of the painting. And the center of the painting, literally, is the beheading of Holofernes, right? That's dead. That's on the central axis of the painting. And that's also a very common compositional device. Artists will place the central element of the narrative on the center, not on the center axis of the painting. Not always, but that's very common. What else? How would we characterize this painting? In other words, is it like a peaceful painting? Is it a romantic painting? Is it a violent painting?
Chaotic.
It's chaotic. Like this scene would be incredibly chaotic, right? Like two relatively small people trying to overcome a huge and brutal figure. And it's violent, right? Someone is in the middle of beheading another person. Really, the narrative of Judith and Holofernes is a violent narrative, right? It's a violent, chaotic narrative. How is that communicated in the composition? We've gotten at it in some ways, but how did Gentileschi think about communicating that in this painting?
I feel like there's something, this is one of the first things I noticed about the painting, is that they're all kind of scooted to the right in the frame. So, like, instead of being symmetrically placed, the figures all feel kind of scooted to the side, which I think just starts the chaos off.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of like heavy on one side, at least in terms of the placement of the two main figures. It's otherwise balanced though. Like Gentileschi, she placed this triangle, right in the center. So it actually gives a kind of structure to the chaos, so that it is in a way heavy on the right because of the movement of Judith and Holofernes, but then there's a kind of covert balancing or covert structure because Gentileschi created almost a kind of like temple-like structure. If we follow the light masses, we can see the kind of roof line of the temple, and then that's on top of this rectangular structure underneath. So there is actually a kind of underlying order. And that's almost always true of paintings at this time. And just the fact that the center of the action is placed on the central axis, that itself suggests a kind of underlying order. But then on top of that order, there's this depiction of chaos. And so the heaviness on the right is probably part of it. What else is happening? Like, why? This gets back to the question of why she placed the figures the way she did. So because of the way Holofernes is placed, we see his upper arm projecting upwards from his head. We see his legs projecting upwards as if from this as a kind of hub in the painting. We see Judith's arms projecting again out from that hub. We see the maidservant's arms projecting out from that hub. We see Holofernes' arm projecting upward from that hub, and that continues into the head of the maidservant. What is that doing? That action, all of these radiating lines coming out from this central point of the trauma. What is that doing? There's these radiating lines coming out.
It kind of draws your attention to it to make it that, like, it emphasizes that that's the focal point.
Yeah, it draws your attention to it for sure. And that's definitely part of the intent. What is this here? What are we looking at there?
Blood splatter.
Yeah, it's spurts of blood. This is actually a very graphic painting by the standards of the time, especially in the realism of that. So we're getting a kind of explosion of blood, right? She's cutting off his head, she's hit an artery, and there's blood exploding out. Everything in the painting reinforces that explosion of violence. That's what this painting is. It depicts that moment of explosive violence. And the composition, in part because of things we've talked about, and importantly because of the placement of the bodies, the way they create these radiating, exploding lines coming out from that point of contact. All create a painting where we're not just being shown violence in a kind of literal way. We are being shown violence, but it's not just that. We're being shown by violence, but the chaos, the trauma, the violence is literally contained in the structure of the painting language, or or we could say the composition of the painting. We could also say, really a synonym for that would be to say that narrative of violence and trauma is contained in the formal elements, in the structure of the formal elements. So the way everything is arranged in this painting is arranged in order to amplify that psychological content that the artist was dealing with. And when you start analyzing paintings, you realize that the paintings that we usually respond to most strongly have these elaborate compositional structures in place. There's virtually always a relationship between what the artist is trying to communicate in the painting and how the artist has arranged the elements of the painting, which in a way, makes painting an incredibly artificial art form, just like most art forms, actually. In that, as anything occurs or unfolds in the world, there's no internal order to it, or there's no internal structure to it in the way it unfolds visually or even sonically. And yet, when we see these things in art, those things are depicted with this elaborate underlying order, which is a little bit, that's on topic, that's what we're dealing with. That's something that fascinates me. It fascinates me the way art has always, and we sort of take it for granted, but the way art has insisted on imbuing works of art with an order that absolutely does not exist in the world. So what I want people to do is take a painting, and hopefully it's a painting that you like or love, and do a compositional study of it. Okay. So before I go into the nuts and bolts of this, the painting that you study should be a complex painting. Okay. And it should be a complex painting where there's an elaborate interplay of light and dark masses. So in this painting by Gentileschi, there's an elaborate arrangement of lights and dark masses, right? So light against dark, 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 and so on. And then it's a complex painting. There's an elaborate number of elements in the painting. So that's the kind of painting you want to look for. So I said that, I said in the document I sent to everybody that a period of painting that often will satisfy those requirements are the Baroque period. So I don't know how knowledgeable people are on art history, but the Gentileschi painting we just looked at was a Baroque painting.
Titian is the Baroque as well, right?
I'm sorry?
Titian?
Titian, yeah, Titian's not technically Baroque, although in many ways we might as well call him Baroque, but he would be a good option, yeah.
Okay.
But so Baroque painting is an option. So, but I just want to say that if you're not that familiar with art history, and so you're not quite sure who you're going to look, what painting you're going to choose, I just want to caution you that just looking up Baroque painting is not necessarily going to give you a painting that satisfies the requirements of the assignment. So for example, this is a famous and I think very overrated Baroque painting by Vermeer. That's too simple for our purposes. That's not, it's very beautifully composed. And Vermeer, I think, is a great artist. I just don't like that painting. So it's just too simple. It's not going to really get you into an in-depth study of a work of art for our purposes. This is another very famous Baroque painting by Caravaggio. Now this painting, and people often choose this for some reason, this painting would be a good painting. And Caravaggio himself would be a good artist to look at. So, okay, so complex painting with an elaborate light and dark arrangement. So a lot of these Baroque paintings would work. So this Rubens would work. This Rubens would work. So these are all artists from the Baroque period. That Rembrandt would work. This would work, maybe getting a little bit too complex, but certainly if you wanted to do that, you could.
Professor?
Yes.
Can I do Caravaggio's David with Goliath's head?
I think that's a little bit too, I think that's a little bit too simple. Let's see. So this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a little bit, basically of 1, 2, 3. I would try to choose something a little bit more complex.
Okay.
I mean, but Caravaggio is a good choice. This Caravaggio, which is a similar painting, that would certainly work. Okay.
Same narrative, actually.
I'm sorry?
Is that also Judith?
Yes, that was also Judith beheading Holofernes, yeah. So this, I think this is more, so in this Caravaggio, I think, I might be wrong about this, I might have this reversed, but I think the maidservant is actually, in the Bible, is an older woman. So Artemisia changed that in her story. But maybe it's the reverse. Maybe Caravaggio changed it, I don't remember. Okay, so that's Baroque painting. I mentioned Baroque painting because that would certainly be a good source of possible images if you don't already have a painting in mind or you don't know what you want to look for. But Baroque painting, Baroque painting is a flawed category because, like most categories of painting that we talk about today, like the Renaissance or the Baroque or Mannerism, those terms were actually not invented until the 19th century. And they don't account for the way different characteristics of one period can be found in others. But so Diana mentioned the artist Titian. So Titian would be a good source of paintings. So that would be a good painting to choose. This is his late work, which is very Baroque. That would be a great one. Would be a great choice. Titian's Entombment. Okay, so Titian is technically Renaissance. On that handout I sent people, all of these artists are listed. This is another artist who's Renaissance, but who would be a great choice. So someone like Veronese. Okay. So, and then we could talk about, I'm going to look at some paintings from later than this. Just since we're talking about composition, let's take a look at this painting. I just want to, just looking at this painting, and Veronese, to use Diana's term, pleasing composition, Veronese was also always very conscious of creating pleasing compositions. Just to start the process of looking at paintings and asking, like, what are some decisions a painter made in terms of composition? Here, I'm not talking so much about the narrative. I don't actually know the subject matter of this painting. But what is something that the artist has done in order to create, let's say, a pleasing composition, but we can also say a composition where there's an overall sense of order and structure, as if everything is working in relationship to everything else. So what is something he's done?
I feel like the artist created like this diagonal across the composition with the tree and the way all the figures are arranged. So there's like everything, like, I mean, all the forms and figures all look arranged in like this diagonal and the composition, that it's kind of like this triangle, this right angle triangle where everything's kind of like fit. And then the rest is kind of like more like the background, so it's deeper.
Yeah, no, that's a really good observation, and that's the sort of the central compositional element, and this is also a very common compositional device in traditional painting. Notice how everything's arranged along that central diagonal, right? So if you were to draw a diagonal from the upper right to the lower left, you'll find that everything sort of tends toward that diagonal. Everything's structured around that diagonal. So the central axis of this figure, the central axis of this figure are parallel to that diagonal. That central diagonal goes right through the center of the tree. It hits this line of the figure's arm. It comes through the hand and the drapery. It's very common. That's sort of the central line of the painting, or the dominant line. You'll often find compositions have a dominant line like that. And then that line, that dominant line, is then reinforced by these supporting lines, like this and this line here. the line of the bridge, right? Those all come in to sort of balance that dominant line of the diagonal. So what are some other things happening? And this painting was just chosen randomly, but what are some other things that the artist has done in the painting?
The way you said that people of more importance are on the top and less importance on the bottom. The person on the bottom is also like the only Black person in the photo.
Yeah, how does that relate to the image compositionally?
Just because of based on
Hierarchically, yeah, you're probably right. Just in terms of the social hierarchy of that time, that's right. And so that is a compositional decision. I don't know what this figure is. Let's see if it's the title of this painting. I hate the way you often can't click on. Don't want to waste time looking. So what are some other things? Whoops. What are some other elements that are intended to create a unity in the painting? Like where do we see unity anywhere else?
I guess in the color, because I see like warm colors also kind of dispersed evenly. Like we have like the figure on the bottom left hand corner wearing the warm orange, and then to kind of balance that, we also have the figure on the right side wearing that warm orange. And then so I feel like the way that the colors are arranged are also like in the center, the main female figure, she's wearing a warm colored dress, but then right next to her there's a woman figure with a cool blue dress. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really important observation, and actually that brings up a really important element I want to address in this final painting. So color as composition, that's really important here. You're absolutely right. There's a balance of warms, right? This figure's wearing orange. This figure's wearing orange. That orange is then picked up in the warmth of the pattern of this figure, right? So those are warm passages in the painting. But if we were to say that this painting overall had a temperature, what would it be? Like, can we say that overall this painting has a certain temperature?
I think it's cool.
It's overall a cool painting. Or I think most people would say that. It's a cool painting that then has these accents of warmth, right? I once had a teacher who said to me that all paintings are either cool or warm. Now my experience has been that that's not really true, but often paintings are either dominantly warm or dominantly cool, and then there are accents in that. So this is a cool painting with accents of warmth. So I do want one element of the painting we're going to be doing, or the abstract painting you do based on your compositional study, will be to think about a color idea. So you don't want to just use color randomly. You want to think about some kind of cohesive color idea in your painting. So one way of thinking about that is thinking, is your painting going to be a warm painting or a cool painting? If it's a warm painting, how do I incorporate cools? If it's a cool, how do I incorporate warms? And I'll talk more about that. But that's a really good observation. Also, notice that all of the leaves, even though we can assume these are different species of trees, all the leaves are drawn with a similar gesture or a similar energy. And notice the direction and the energy of the boughs of the leaves. Those are repeated in the clouds. So it's almost like this bough of leaves here and then these clouds here are all part of the same kind of organizing principle. And notice how the leaves, this leaf leads into this cloud backs up into that bough of the leaves. So there's a kind of order in the way all of these different elements, which when we see them in the world, have no internal cohesion to them, right? When we're out walking and we look at the trees and the sky, we have no reason to expect that there's going to be a formal balance and a formal harmony between the clouds and the different species of tree that are within our field of vision, right? There's absolutely no harmony. Sometimes by chance there may be something that we can perceive, but there's no expectation of that, where all of that's been harmonized in the painting. And we could keep going in further depth talking about this painting. So that's Baroque and Renaissance. So plenty of choices from those periods. So can anybody, and this, again, I'm not sure how much art history people know. Can anybody think of a 20th century painter who might who might satisfy these requirements?
Picasso?
Yeah, some Picassos would. So the assignment is to go from a representational painting to an abstract painting. So we couldn't really use Picasso's.
What his early work would be
Yeah,
before.
his early work or his what's called his classical period. So painting something like this would certainly work.
Portrait, maybe?
Yeah, this would work. This is a single figure, but there's a complexity of elements. This is an early piece.
Period, yeah. I was gonna say.
Yeah, that would work. So again, you would want to stay away from paintings that are too simple. That's a little bit too simple. This could work, certainly. So Picasso could be a good choice. That's a possibility. Any other? Anybody else think of any names?
Grant Wood.
I'm sorry, who?
Grant Wood. Like he made
Yeah,
the painting.
Grant Wood. Sure. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of Grant Wood, but some of his
The
paintings.
farm. Like
I'm sorry?
I know his painting with the farmers, with the husband and wife, the first one.
Yeah, so that's a very famous American painting. That actually would work. You know, any of these paintings by Grant Wood would work. Yeah, so that's an option. Some of Isabel Bishop's paintings could work. You know, they verge on the abstract. They're figures in environments. It's actually a little bit too similar in value, not quite enough complexity of value, but this painting could certainly work. It's a painting of Union Square. So that painting could work. Edward Hopper would work. So, you know, a painting like this could certainly work. So let's see, like Frida Kahlo is going to be a little bit more, this happens with Frida Kahlo. You type in her name, you get photographs of her. Give me a break. That's what happens when you become a pop culture icon. So Frida Kahlo paintings could work. Something like that, certainly. Some of her paintings, you want to be careful. Sometimes her paintings are that the elements are a little bit too close in value. So there's not really a complex interplay of lights and darks. There's certainly light and dark here, but then if we go into this passage, that's all very similar in value. So you want to choose a painting where there's a complexity of lights and darks, or light and dark masses. So I have a list, and the list can be added to. A contemporary artist, if anyone wants to go contemporary, is Lisa Yaskavage. So she's an artist working today. And her paintings could certainly work. Not big enough. So these paintings could work. So Lisa Yaskavage would be an option. So certainly, I give a fairly long list of paintings, and but those aren't, you're not required to choose from that list. In fact, if you had a favorite painting that you would rather work from, I'd rather you do that, because I'd like you to work on a painting that you have some attachment to, ideally. So let's stick with Lisa Yaskavage for a minute, because now I want to talk about, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but bear this in mind. So this is Lisa Yaskavage here in her studio, and this is one of her paintings. So we can start, this is a good painting to start talking about color ideas. What's the color idea of this painting?
Red.
Red. Very simple, straightforward answer. This is a red painting. It's a warm painting, obviously. It's a red painting. And then she's very, very consciously played with accenting that red with blue. And Lisa Yaskavage loves to do this kind of thing. She loves to have these kind of like red paintings, but then with this little moment of an intense color peering through. So remember, thinking about a color idea. This is one way to think about a color idea. So I'm going to make a red painting. I'm going to make a green painting, right? Lisa Yaskavage loves that. I'm going to make a blue painting, right? Over and over again. Lisa Yaskavage, that's the way she works. A yellow painting or a gold painting. So that's certainly one approach. This is essentially a kind of warm gray painting, right? Accented with this kind of ochre. And Lisa Yaskavage, what's going on with Lisa Yaskavage's painting and composition in terms of her composition? Like, what are some things you notice about this painting? Like, how is this painting structured compositionally?
There's a lot of vertical lines.
A lot of verticals, and what else? Verticals and
even the figures themselves, they're just kind of like vertical lines because
Yeah.
they're so slender, lean, long. Their limbs like kind of mirror like those vertical lines in that front like gate and the column.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the figures are painted so that they repeat those verticals, of course, with the exception of the female figure's leg, right? Which is part of this one diagonal that's very carefully placed in the painting.
And those, oh, I'm sorry. And I noticed that the long vertical lines are even like emphasized in the reflection of light that's peering through the arches, the archways, and we see it reflected on the floor. So then those also kind of extend those vertical lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I just want to pull up a famous mid-century abstract painter. So Agnes Martin was a very famous mid-century abstract painter, and her paintings are we could call them minimalism. It's a kind of minimalism that she thought sort of attained to a kind of spiritual experience. And I find that convincing in a lot of her work. But in a funny way, Agnes Martin, who many of whose paintings are based on a grid, that's actually what's happening here in Licia Scavige's painting, right? It's the painting, the composition of the painting is based on a grid. So it's a play between verticals and horizontals. The verticals are dominant, but the horizontals are important. So there's a play between horizontals and verticals, and then she's also then pulling in these diagonals. So she's playing with that kind of order that comes, that implied order that comes from horizontals and diagonals. And giving the paintings, in spite of there's always a tension in Licia Scavige's work between a kind of absurdity or, absurdity is not quite the right word. There's almost something like degraded about her subject matter. There's something sort of perverse, grotesque, certainly a lot of times. And she would play with objects that had that implication, like a series of paintings she did of sex dolls, that's in the 90s. But then there's a tension created because that element of the grotesque and the absurd and the degraded is balanced by hyper-realized classical order in the composition. Which again gets at how important composition is. That tension and that strange pull between the beautiful and the grotesque in her work has a lot to do with the way she composes the subject matter. So, but we were getting at a color idea. So that's one example of a color idea. So let's go back to our original painting and talk. What's the color idea in this painting? We can actually use these paintings to talk about this. What's the color idea in this painting? This is actually
I feel like there's very warm lighting, like strong warm lighting, or like really concentrated warm lighting, because their body, the body highlights, there's all like these like warm yellow kind of tones and golds. But then there's also the red, like the red velvet cloth that is wrapped around his body or
Yes.
dress. I don't know. I feel like I see warm colors, but then it's contrasted with a really dark black background.
It
I
looks
I think you're right. It's a warm, certainly a warm painting.
the this is like a dead palette, wouldn't you say?
This is definitely a dead palette painting. Yes, for sure. It's also, and dead palette probably with no blue. It's probably just black.
Yeah.
This is a very common color idea in the Renaissance and the Baroque period. And sometimes it's referred to neutral with one intense color. So it's essentially a neutral painting, right? It doesn't, you know, most parts of the painting, the skin tones, the background, the drapery, they're not strongly asserting a color. They're not strongly asserting a temperature, but then the painting has one vibrant accent. So here it would be the reds. So that's another color idea, and you could work that into a composition. So the kind of like overall neutral painting with an accent of color. So this is a contemporary painting by an artist named Dana Schutz. What's the color idea here? Like, is this warm or cool?
Warm.
Yeah, it's a warm painting, right? And then this is balanced by some cool, some warm violets, but they work as cool overall. And the color of the painting is based on that big rectangle of yellow, right? And then this play of warm, darker temperatures in the figures above. We were talking about classical impulses in compositions. Dana Schutz has done it here. So she's taken her rectangle and she's divided the rectangle with a square inside. So she's used that long blade of grass. The only reason that's there is for composition. It creates a square within the rectangle. And that's a very common device in classical paintings in order to give the painting a kind of like it has an order by virtue of the fact that it's made in a rectangle, and then that order is reinforced by inserting a square into that rectangle. So it imbues a work of art with a kind of internal geometric structure. It's a very common device for creating a sense of unity and creating a sense of stability in a painting. So we've talked about warm and cool color ideas. So these are two examples of neutral paintings. This is a neutral painting, but that's a color idea. Here's a neutral painting with accents of warm, okay?
Are those too simple?
Let me see.
Like the one to the left?
You know, this is a simple painting, but you could use this. It's both, it's simple, but actually very complex in many ways. So you could use this. This is by Chardin.
Professor, we can paint like the objects?
No, so you're going to do a study. I'll talk about the process. You'll do a study of this and then turn it into an abstraction. So I'll explain that more in a few minutes. I'm just right now just talking about color ideas. So we looked at this Bonnard. This has a multitude of colors. So we've talked about simple color ideas like Licia Scavege's red, green, yellow paintings. We've talked about a color idea that's based on the neutral plus one accent. This painting, we've talked about warm and cool paintings. This painting is a little bit more difficult, I think, to determine exactly what the color idea is. But let's take a stab at it. Does this have an overall color idea?
I believe it's overall warm from the sun, and then the cool parts would be the shadow of the house where the sun isn't hitting.
Yeah, I mean, Bonnard is definitely playing with color temperature to create a sense of light.
So red is like a prominent color in the
Yeah,
entire.
I feel like this is like like we could say that this is the dominant color here is red, right? So that's part of the color idea. And then notice there's a lot of color, but it's not randomly arranged. Like notice how this kind of irregular shape, starting with the edge of the table and then coming up to the door, that's the left-hand side of the shape. And then the right-hand side of the shape is the right-hand side of the table, up along the door opening, and then around this window here. That's where all of the cool colors are condensed, right? So there's this dense network of cool colors all throughout this kind of irregular central passage. So he's got a wide range of colors, but it's ordered based on that dominant red and then the clustering of all these cools. So this is complex, but it doesn't mean there's not a color idea there. So a warm painting, right? We've been talking about warm and cool. This is a Mary Cassatt painting. A neutral painting with intense accent. Right? This is also a Baroque painting. So I don't know, overall, what is this? What's the temperature of this Monet?
Cool.
Warm?
Warm. It has some warmth, but there's definitely, I mean, when you think, it evokes a coolness because of, I guess when you think of snow.
Well, and the color of the shadow, but I agree. I think it's a warm painting with a very prominent cool accent. So are the idea, is that concept of a color idea, is that fairly clear? Would anyone like me to clarify? I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but can I clarify it any further? So, anyone know who this artist is?
Piet Mondrian.
Mondrian, right. So what is Mondrian's color idea?
Primary colors.
Primary colors, exactly. So all of Mondrian's paintings from a certain period are based on the primary colors: yellow, red, and blue, plus black and white. So why was he doing that? So Mondrian thought that his painting was achieving a kind of almost a kind of like spiritual purity. So everything had to be reduced to the very basic elements. So from a certain point in his work, he used nothing but red, blue, yellow, black, and white. And he also, by the way, used nothing but horizontals and verticals. He didn't use any diagonals. So that's another kind of color idea. So I'd like people to think about color idea. And I think as we go through these paintings, you can identify some kind of color idea that's dominant throughout. It's a little harder here, but okay. So this would be a good choice, that Caravaggio. All right, so actually let me go back. So again, what's the color idea here? This Kerry James Marshall.
White.
Yeah, I would say gray, not white, but gray. Again, with like the accent of warm and then cool. But it's a kind of gray color scheme, a cool gray color scheme. Okay, so people, this would be a good choice. This is Sebastiano Ricci. Okay, so find a painting you love, and what you want, once you find that painting, I want you to do a simplified study of the painting, similar to this. So what the artist did in this is they simplified this painting into just 3 values. So they simplified it into white, middle, and black. And then everything in this painting has been simplified so that it is painted with nothing but these 3 tones. So everything in the painting had to be assigned one of these tones. So like the Judith's arm, that's that's going to be white because that's closest to white out of these 3 tones. That's a judgment call, but this artist said that was closer to the middle value. So that's going to be a middle value. The side of Judith's head, the passage on the bed down here, that's all black. Okay. So you're going to be radically simplifying the painting. So you're not going to go in with a little brush and paint the eyebrows and the eyes. Forget all that stuff. You don't need to do any of the folds here. What you want to do is you want to find the big dominant value shapes that create the composition. Does that make sense to people? Like if you compare this to this, is the process the artist used to arrive at this, is that clear?
Yeah, it's kind of like we're going to be working backwards because we've been, like the technique that you've been teaching us is to paint like color masses, like blocks of color that we see.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, but here we see like the full-blown painting and we're kind of going backwards to kind of do that first step. Like what would the masses of color have been, or like what would the original forms be?
Exactly.
Sort of.
Exactly. So, and then what you're going to do is use this as a basis for your own abstract painting. So you're going to make an abstract painting using this study as the kind of underlying basis of your painting. Okay, so what I mean by that is this is then going to be a kind of guide, a kind of foundation for your painting. So something like this. So I got this from a drawing book. This is a similar study. So a student did a composition study of this Picasso painting. And what they did was they used this Picasso painting as a compositional guide for this still life they set up. So this is not a very good painting here. I mean, it's not very inspired. But, what it is it's an overturned pot. It's 2 pieces of fruit, another vase here. I don't know what that is, but it's drapery here. And all of that stuff is arranged according to the kind of underlying compositional structure of this painting. Do people see that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
It's a way of really studying the composition of a painting you like by actually using that in your painting. So here's
Wait, so
another.
I'm sorry. So, that project that student did with the still life, that with the objects that are arranged in the same kind of composition as Picasso's painting, that's what we're going to do, the still life, or we're just going to make an abstract painting without.
You're not going to do a still life. You're going to make an abstract painting, but in the same,
Okay.
the same like basic idea. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes sense. It's really cool. Yeah.
Okay, so this is another example. So this is a painting by Delacroix, who was an early 19th century painter. This is called The Death of Sardanapalus. And a friend of mine several years ago made an abstract painting based on this painting. So she took this painting and then she created this painting here. So she used the basic underlying compositional structure of this representational painting
Wow, that's cool.
and then used that as a kind of foundation to base this abstraction on. So do people see how she did that? So where this bed projects out, she's broken that bed up into a series of abstract shapes. And her abstraction, while it varies in some ways from this, it's basically using the underlying foundation of Delacroix's painting to make this painting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So one thing I want to point out here, this is, I think, an important thing for many people. Notice how in this painting by Delacroix, this area goes completely black. Kristen Baker decided to break that area up. Like, she didn't think that her painting would be interesting if this just went completely black. So she broke that area up, and you can certainly do that. You don't have to be a slave to the original. You can add things, you can use it as a jumping off point. But I do want people to try to stay with the basic structure of the light and dark arrangement. So notice how in this painting, that basic, it's not a slavish copy, but Kristen Baker keeps that sense of like the light masses where they are in the painting, similar to the Delacroix. Now she didn't want this area to go completely black, so she broke that up. But notice how all these shapes are close in value to one another. Do you see what I mean? So it stays as a kind of dark area. That's an exception. She added that completely on her own. I guess she wanted something coming down here more dramatically. But this is the basic idea. So the basic idea is to start with a painting like this, or this, do a study of it, and then use this as a jumping off point. So I mentioned the way Kristen Baker broke up one big dark passage in the original. This is also a big dark passage that if someone were to use this painting as a jumping off point for an abstraction, this might be too empty. So you might want to play with breaking up this area, but breaking it up with shapes that are all stay within the same value. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the basic assignments. So are there any questions about it? This is Kristen Baker. That's a full view of Kristen Baker's painting.
Professor,
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
are we limited to the colors that we're using for this painting, or can we use whatever?
No, you can use whatever colors. You can invent any color idea you want.
Oh, okay. I was gonna ask that. So if you wanted to do black, white, and gray, and like one other color, that would be fine.
Yes, yeah. The study should be done with just black, white, and gray. But the final painting you do can be any color idea you want, any color at all. it doesn't have to stay with the colors in the original.
And the same thing goes for the shapes, right? Like you can create new shapes as well.
Yes, yes, you want to use this as a kind of basic structure, but yeah, you can change these shapes. And sometimes people hand in an assignment where they do this painting, and then they just do another version of this, but this becomes like yellow, this becomes blue. I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to do just a colored version of this painting. I want this to be a foundation or a springboard to an abstraction where you start inventing shapes the way Kristen Baker did, right? So she actually eliminated that figure. Here, this figure bending over the bed, she didn't just like cut out that shape and then color it in. She invented a whole series of different kinds of shapes that still stay with that basic underlying structure. Does that make sense?
This seems very different from what we have been learning. Like,
yeah, it is very different. It's a departure. I mean, it's designed to get people to start thinking about composition. We don't do we don't do any composition really throughout the semester, but it's a really important element. So in the last assignment, I want people to start thinking about it. But yeah, it's a departure.
So, Professor, fast painting we have to use three colors, right? The final project we can use any of the color. Like
that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. And I think was that Fatima?
Yeah. Okay.
I think you asked. Oh no, Selena. I think you asked yesterday, or somebody asked yesterday, if this assignment had 3 paintings. There are only 2 paintings that you have to do. You have to find one painting, and then you have to do 2 paintings. So you have to do this painting, and then the final painting based on it.
And they both are abstraction.
And they're both what?
Abstraction.
Well, I mean, do you consider this an abstraction?
No.
It's
No,
abstract.
Or just the last one.
It has to be this. You want it to be a simplification like this. And yes, the last one should be an abstraction.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any other questions? So when you do your...
Should we send you the picture that we're going to use?
Yes, send me I want to approve your choice of the painting. So you should, and I only do that because, not because I want to approve your taste. I don't mean it to come off that way, but only because sometimes people, when I don't do that, sometimes people choose, paintings that are just not appropriate to study composition the way we're studying it. So what you do need to send me your painting before you get started. And you should try to do it, just to give yourself enough time, you should try to have your painting chosen within a couple of days. I will give you until the very last day of grading to finish this. So this you don't actually have to have finished on the last day of class. Okay, so I'm almost positive that we will be able to submit grades on Monday, July 27th. That's usually the way they do it on summer session. So next Wednesday is our last class. Grades will be due on Monday, July 27th. So you have until Sunday, July 26th to finish this assignment. Okay.
So, Professor, just to make sure, how many more assignments we have left to do? Because we finished up the 3 triangle stars colors,
yep.
And then we have these 2 left, I believe, right?
And then you have the full spectrum still life.
Mm-hmm. The one we did yesterday showed us.
The demo yesterday, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So Yeah, are there any questions about this assignment?
So will you be showing us a demo on Monday about like how to do the abstraction?
I haven't. I've never done that. I mean, in a way, it doesn't quite like. I could. I mean, if people want me to, I could try. I mean, it doesn't quite lend itself to an abstraction, but I mean, the other thing about it is, you know, you want to, you know, in a way, like this is an opportunity for you to explore a way of working that's sort of self-invented, as much as we're able to do that. But I can, if people would find that helpful, I can give you some pointers on how to do that. Would people like that?
I'd be more interested to see a demo of this, like what's on the screen right now, like the simplification,
Okay.
if anything, because I feel like that's going to be really difficult to do.
Well,
To like,
I can do both of those things. I'll do that. I can do that.
Okay, quick question, the simplification. I mean, are you in particular, like what if we simplify it, but we just use like shapes? Because that's what I was thinking of when you're talking about simplification here.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically simplified
Like,
into just shape.
it looks like a rectangle, you know, like.
Yeah, that's how you should be simplifying. It should be into just shape. Yeah. So like, but I will do a demo. I'll do a demo, you know, and walk you through some of the, but just, you know, before that, I'm sure there's a shortcut. So like notice here, so notice in this Artemisia painting, this dark here, you know, has detail in it and it's a kind of irregular shape. But in this painting, it's in this simplification, it's been turned into a kind of triangle. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is going to be a kind of, you're simplifying it into large masses and large shapes. You know, if you, but I will do a demo on Monday. I don't usually, to be honest with you, but I'm happy to do it. So.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Okay, so again, any other questions?
Do we need to send you the painting before we start it?
Yes, please send me the painting you choose, just so that just to make sure that it's satisfying like the requirements.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so
I emailed it to you.
I'm sorry?
I said I just emailed it to you, Professor.
Okay. Okay. So I need to take a break. And then for the remainder of the class, I'll be doing a demo on painting a reflective object. We don't have a lot of time in the demo. I know some people want to do a reflective object. Does anybody want information on painting glass? Or are people just interested in reflective objects?
Yeah, glass, like a vase.
Okay, so I will, you know, I'll do as much as I can on both. Okay, but so let's take a break and we'll get started at 10:45, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Professor, you're still screen sharing.
So, so again, in some ways, painting.
Can I get permission to record?
Yes. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, so painting reflective surfaces or glass, I think in some ways is easier than painting forms that reveal light and shadow. And the reason is because I think that you can simplify reflective surfaces and glass into a series of, into a kind of pattern-like shape or a series of pattern-like shapes. So as you're looking at, so like this reflective surface here, what is accounting for the pattern of light and shadow we see on this object? Like what is creating those patterns?
Circle.
Light.
Well, light is, but why do we see, like, why do we see that orange color there?
Reflection.
Reflection.
It's a straightforward reflection of that drapery, right? This object is a reflective object. So it doesn't respond to light in the same way that most objects do because there's something about the structure of the surface of that object that reflects light directly back to the viewer. So if we had a, give me 1 second. If we put a regular coffee mug in place of that that's not a good example. That's also reflective. Let's see. If we put our cone where we're going to put the mug, this has light and it moves into shadow, right? So where you can no longer see, or where the cone, so you're seeing it. So where the cone turns away from the light source, you see shadow. Because there's no light hitting this surface of the cone. So that rolls around into shadow. And the only reason we're seeing anything over there is ambient light is bouncing off of other objects, bouncing off this and then back to us. Now, the structure of the surface of a reflective object works differently. Because what happens is it reflects light directly back to us. So we're getting a clear reflection of the window here. So this here is a reflection of the window. This here is what I'm pointing to there. That's a reflection of my black shirt standing in front of it. So this black strip you see is my black shirt. This white is the white wall of my studio over in that direction. And then right down here, that is simply a mirror-like reflection of the surface it's sitting on. And all you need to do is identify those different things that the object is reflecting, and it will help you see clearly what color they need to be. And then the shape of those reflections are going to depend on the shape of the object. So if this were a rounder vase, then those reflections would bend out to us. So painting glass, I'm basically painting what's behind the glass, right? I can see the drapery through the glass, except I don't see the drapery in a completely unaltered way because the glass refracts the light. So the way I'm seeing the drapery has been modified and altered. But what I'm basically going to be painting is a modified version of the drapery behind it, plus these highlights. Okay. So just as we do with all of our everything we paint in this class, I'm going to start with the background. Oh, wrong color. That's transparent red oxide. I don't have my magenta out. So I will quickly make our magenta background. I guess a better color to call that is the salmon background. And I'm going to do the same thing I did yesterday, just blocking quickly around the basic shapes of these objects. So just very quickly draw these objects. So that's where my glass is going to be. So anybody who is going to be painting a reflective object, just look really carefully at the visual information on the surface that you're looking at. So if it's a copper surface or a silver-like surface, and notice how what you're looking at is a slightly distorted reflection of the surrounding space. So I'll just block in quickly. I'm not going to do any details around these objects. Just to get, and I could, by the way, I could easily just paint the background right over where I want that glass to be. But I'm going to, just because I think that might be a little bit confusing, I'm going to do it a slightly different way. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of a cast shadow created by the glass, but since light passes through the glass, it's not a very prominent one. But you do still want to indicate that cast shadow, just so that you have a sense of the object being firmly planted on the table. There is a definite cast shadow behind our coffee container. So just putting in that subtle cast shadow there. Okay, so now I'm going to start with the reflective, with the coffee container. So the first thing, I'm going to simplify, I'm going to block in, I'm going to simplify the big strands of black and white. I mean of different grades, because basically I'm looking at a whole series of grades. So the first gray I see is a grayed down version of the color of the drapery. So I'm gonna mix up the color of the drapery again. And so you can see it. So what I'm doing is I'm painting I'm simplifying that reflection, the reflection here on the drapery. So that is, again, looking at the drapery, it's slightly darker, slightly grayer than the drapery itself. So I'm going to gray it down a little bit with some green, because green is the opposite of blue. And it's nearly the same value as the background. And I'm going to put in very broadly that first stripe of reflection. And you almost can't see it separate from. And then I noticed that at the bottom of my coffee can, I'm getting, and you're going to need to look at this in the photograph I sent to be able to see it. I'm getting a little bit more of a clear reflection of the drapery along the bottom of that can. So I'm going to paint that in broadly. And I'm just looking at the shape it's taking on. It's taking on a shape, something like that. And it's not, right now it's not, there's not a big distinction between the reflection of the drapery on the coffee can and the drapery itself. I'm going to just pull out my coffee can by indicating the occlusion shadow just underneath the rim, so I know exactly where that is. So what I'm going to be doing is basically painting the shapes that are reflected in the surface of the coffee can. So I have the first rough in of that of the drapery as it's reflected in the coffee can, and then I notice up at the top of the coffee can, the reflection of the drapery is darker than the drapery behind it. So I'm going to do a couple things. One, I think the drapery behind it can be a little bit lighter. So I'm going to lighten the drapery just behind the coffee can. That separates them out a little bit, and I think that's about right. I think that it should be lighter like that, and maybe even a little bit lighter still. So just modifying wet into wet, the color I initially put down for the background. Lighter over here. Okay, so now as I look at this coffee can, and again, you're going to need to refer to the photo more than what you're seeing on the screen. I have a large kind of gray, like overall there's a large gray shape coming down here. And then I start to get lighter shapes over here. So I'm going to simplify that big light shape of gray, and then I'm going to work into it. So I don't think there's any reason for me to mess around with a whole range of grays mixed from opposites. I'm just going to use black and white, but it's a warm gray. So I'm going to warm that gray up with yellow ochre. And then I'm going to just paint, I'm going to simplify the shape of the reflection. And that reflection comes over to here, to about here. So again, like I did with that green drapery last week, like I did with the drapery yesterday, I'm first starting with very simple, big shapes that I'm identifying, and then I'll break them up. So there's a big mass of gray streaks. Let's just call them gray streaks that create the reflection that we're looking at. And it comes down in a shape something like this. That green, that might be a little bit too gray. I mean, it might be a little bit too green, but it's okay for now. Okay, now as you can see, although I see the reflected light, I mean, I see the highlight a little bit differently than you do on the monitor, but there is a big highlight coming down there. And I do want to put that in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove where I want to remove most of the paint where I want that highlight to be. I'm just taking my rag, going through that paint. So that's we could call that a subtractive painting process. And then from my point of view, there's then another thin highlight right here. So I'm going to remove that. And then I'm going to go in with some pure white paint. And I'm going to use relatively thick paint here. I'm going to drag that down. So there at the bottom, it has a couple of, turns into a couple striations. So I'm asking myself what's being reflected in order to help me draw the shape of it and place where it is. So that's just a big, long reflection of the window. And then I have two windows in my studio. I think this is a reflection of the window behind. Now I'm going to, the relation or the edge between those shapes isn't sharp, so I'm going to soften that edge. Soften this edge. So in a way, I find this kind of easy compared to other things we're doing because in a way, I'm just painting stripes. And if you get the color of the stripes and the value of the stripes pretty close, then it's not that hard to end up with a convincing looking reflective surface. Okay. So that's not right. So then this side over here is this, then I go to a lighter, overall a lighter gray over here. It's not as dark as that gray. So I'm going to mix up a lighter and slightly cooler gray to put in as a base over there. I see areas in the painting where there's a little bit of a brighter, more pure reflection of the drapery. So here, it's just a little bit brighter and more intense orange. And so this may be obvious to people, but the reason the reflection ends here is because that's the edge of the table as it's reflected in the, on the reflective surface of the object. And then we're getting, then we can see some of the folds reflected. We'll bring those in. Then on the where there's the reflection of the drapery on the left-hand side of this object, there's a streak of lighter reflection in that. And I'm going to keep, so now I have a simple rough-in of a big simple blocking in or massing in of the major components of that reflection. Now I'm going to just start adding to it. So on the right-hand side of that central dark gray shade, there's a long streak of black, which is a reflection of my t-shirt. That fades out a little bit. And depending on how far away the object that's being reflected is from the surface of the vessel, it's going to be softer or harder. So these edges where the drapery is being reflected in the surface of the vessel, those are soft edges. Let's soften those edges. Okay, so this is a very simplified area. So I'm going to add some detail to that. So there's actually a pretty strong light reflection here. So I know Diana has a copper object. I don't know if anybody else does. But with copper, the same thing is happening, but the copper color has more influence on the color of the things reflected. So everything becomes a kind of coppery color. So I'm going to use my middle gray. To complete the I'm going to block in the top ellipse, just very simply using a middle gray. So still using the middle gray. Remember, I've warmed this up. So I'm going to indicate the rim of the object. So we see a little dark strip underneath underneath the lip of the rim. So now there are prominent highlights on that rim that are characteristic of a reflective object. So very prominent highlight here. Right above where the highlight is on the base of the object. Highlight there. And then there's a very prominent highlight over here. And painting wet into wet, I'm going to start to indicate the highlights on the far end of that rim. So I'm seeing the inside of that rim just because of highlights. I'm going to take some black or near black just to indicate some of the very dark accents. Underneath the ridge, again, of that inner rim. And so I'm basically just copying shapes, almost like stripes and reflected shapes of the object around it. It's all I'm doing. It's kind of a process of copying the shapes of the reflections. And there's less, I find there to be less of a challenge of figuring out exactly how the light transitions across the object, because we're just getting a kind of pattern of different colored shapes across the surface. So the reflection there's a reflection here. Again, I've talked about this reflection there of the drapery. There's still part of that right along the edge that's a little bit darker. So the reflection of the drapery goes darker along the edge, so I'm bringing that in. And that's just going to help clarify the edge of the can from the drapery behind it.
It's crazy how much it starts to look like metal after.
After putting in the rim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like suddenly it's no longer like stripes.
Yeah, that helps a lot. I mean, the thing about, that's deceptive about reflective surfaces because they really, what they do look like really is just a series of stripes or shapes. And then, you know, with a few accents, I guess we could say that ground it. It makes that all sort of knit together into a believable object.
Especially, I think, the part of the lip that has a little bit of the pink in it. That
Right.
like,
Yeah, because that's obviously picking up the.
yeah.
Over here, there are more variations to these stripes. You know, and I could keep going on those. I'm going to give that a rest for a few minutes to deal with the glass. So this is a process now of just continuing in the same approach, just adding more and more, or however much of the information I want. You don't have to put everything in there to make it convincing. But this can continue to be refined. So give more, but now that I have that, that has a little bit more of a soft, it's a soft edge. Has an edge that's kind of both soft and serrated at the same time. So it's serrated like a saw. So I would now go in and start to refine these stripes, make them appear more like they appear on the jar. So these highlights aren't quite so much just stripes, but again, they fade out on the right-hand side. And there's much more information in here that I would probably put in. There's slight lightness in here. Okay, so the glass. So I'm going to take back what I said a few minutes ago. I am just going to block in. I'm going to block in the color of the background pretty broadly in there. I'm sort of roughly keeping conscious of where the glass is. I didn't exactly mean to make the background, I mean the color, I just put in a slightly different color, but it is, but that's okay. That helps you keep where the glass is. Okay. So what is, like, how do I see the glass? So I'm seeing the glass primarily because of a series of variations to the transparency of it because of the way the light is refracting through the thickness of the glass. So I'm going to start this by, I'm going to start it by very lightly. So on the right-hand side of the glass, I see a little bit of the grayishness of the can reflecting back onto the glass. So we're getting a little bit of a gray in here. There's a shape of gray that then is picked up on the ellipse. And I'm going to use that same gray to just draw out the parameters of my glass, or the perimeter of my glass, not parameters. So there's the ellipse. And then on the left-hand side, I also see a slightly grayish reflection. It's the reflective surface of the glass picking up I think picking up the reflection of the window. So that gives me a start for the glass. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play some of the more prominent highlights and dark shades. So from where I'm standing, I see a prominent highlight on the inner shape, on the inner surface of the glass. There. And that's quite bright. And I'm going to go into that with paint. And I'm going to try to start to get the exact shape of that highlight. So the highlight comes down like this. And then there are two more highlights. So there's a thin one here. And as I draw my brush downward, I'm lifting up a little bit. I'm letting the brush touch the surface with a little bit less pressure because the highlight, it's a little bit less light, it's a little bit pink. That highlight turns like a hook at the bottom like that because that highlight is wrapping around the inner curved surface of the drinking glass. This one doesn't go down that far, it stops right around there. Refine this highlight a bit. This highlight also curves a little, slightly like a hook. That's also curving around that inner surface of the glass. And if I don't want to look at so there's a little bit of slightly more intense highlight there. And there are these three stripes, almost like stripes on a sports uniform right there. Then at the bottom, let's make this. Start to indicate some of the variety on those. And then at the bottom of my ellipse, there are two highlights. I've made them a little bit big. I can go in and there are two more there where those highlights are. Those are highlights that are being created by the glass where it's thicker at the base. Two slightly less prominent highlights there. Now I can see I can make out some of the bottom surface of that glass. and I can distinguish between the relatively thin glass here and the thicker glass at the base, because those different areas reflect light differently or refract light differently. And so I'm seeing something like what you're seeing in the reflection. So you'll notice here on the glass, we can go from a band of color that's roughly the same as the color of the drapery to some colors that are darker. There's a shape, a striated shape of darker color. Then we get another light band. And so I'm not seeing exactly what you're seeing in the reflection, but I'm seeing something like that. So now I'm going to go in and ask myself, what color should that darker shape be? Again, I don't see it exactly as you're seeing it in the reflection, but I think that I would make that color. I think I would gray down the fabric color. I'm not going to add black to the color of the glass, or the color of the drapery on the glass. I'm going to make a grayed down fabric color. That seems to me to be the right color. And then I'm going to just go in there and as carefully as possible. And if this were my painting that I was going to keep working on, I would do this. And then I would certainly need to go in and change and modify. I'm not going to get this exactly right on the first pass. But so I'm seeing these kind of complex, irregular shapes of darker and lighter versions of what is essentially the color of the drapery behind it. And at this stage in the painting, all I can do is start indicating the major ones, or the ones that to me seem most prominent. And then, depending on how much information I want in there, I'm just going to continue to add more and more evidence of the way the light's refracting. So I'm seeing something like this at the bottom of that glass. And then I see a line that does something like this. And then along the bottom, on the bottom surface of the glass. So this is one of those, I don't know, what is this called, a highball glass? This is one of those glasses that has a thick, maybe half-inch base of glass at the bottom. So what I'm painting right now is the bottom of, where the bottom of the liquid would be. And that I can see that ellipse, or I can see a kind of distorted version of the ellipse. That's in there, something like that. Okay, so now I see stripe over there like that. You know, and again, at this stage of the painting, this is not very, very finely realized detail. I'm still in the blocking in stage. Let's see a little irregular shape there. And then that irregular shape fades out as we go up. Now, an important part of making that glass convincing is getting the highlights on the front rim of the ellipse. So I have the highlights on the back rim, the highlight here on the front rim. A little highlight over here. It's a reflection on the top of that. You know, it's kind of like we're just painting a series of highlights and reflections that are somehow contained by sort of the invisible structure of the vessel. So, you know, I'm going to now, you know, I would start now going in smaller and smaller and making finer and finer observations about exactly what the colors are. So on the left-hand side of this glass, I see a relatively warm, yellowish, gray series of lines that wrap around the surface of the glass. And I'm not positive what these are reflections of, but I think that they're probably reflections of the window. And they have a very particular they have a very, sorry, loud truck. They have a very particular shape to them. To do justice to that shape, I would need to go into to smaller brushes. So it's really just about seeing these shapes. What's their color? What's their value? Where are they sitting in relationship to each other? And remember, primarily with painting glass, you're seeing, unless it's colored glass, or unless it's frosted glass, you're going to be seeing the color of the objects that it's sitting on. You're seeing that through the glass. So I would now just continue to, in effect, add more and more of this information. So, you know, if I were now continuing to work on this glass, I would, these highlights are smaller. I just make them bigger. I would go in and paint around them so that I make them a little bit smaller. There's around those highlights, there are little shapes of gray.
It feels like you almost have to choose where the highlights or those bits of gray go, though.
It's like you have to choose what?
Like you just kind of like have to pick where they go because it's so hard to parse out, at least to my eyes, especially around the base of the glass.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be accurate. I mean, you know, we're going to see them in one location depending on, you know, assuming we're keeping our head in the same position. But I mean, something related to what you said, I guess part of what I think is easier about painting reflective surfaces, I'm remembering now, it's kind of painstaking. Like it's a lot of little looking and little adjustment of those shapes. But something that's easier about it is it's more forgiving because you don't, you know, there's a little bit more, I guess probably in terms of the science of light, there isn't any more chaos. But it appears that we're looking at something more chaotic than, let's say, light on a cone. You know, so it's more forgiving. Like you can put the highlights can be in slightly different, you know, slightly wrong places, or the shapes can be not exact, and it'll still be convincing.
Yeah. Professor, if you wanted to go ahead and try to do the grooves in the coffee can and catch those like horizontal reflections, how would you try to do that?
Well, so the grooves are just, what the grooves are doing is they are surfaces of that can that are facing different reflective surfaces, right? So I probably, to be honest with you, if I was going to have painted this, including the grooves, I would have, in this case, I would have done a careful drawing. But that doesn't mean we can't go into this. So let's just take the top groove. Let's just take this groove. This groove is one plane that's turned under towards this surface and one plane that's turned up towards the ceiling. So the plane that's turned under towards this surface is just reflecting a different series of a different set of visual information. So if I had hours in the rest of the day and I just wanted to work on this, the first thing I would do is, I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, you can see it on the screen. The first underplane of that groove, that's primarily a dark band. Do you see that? Do you know what I mean by that? It's primarily dark.
Yes.
So I would go in with a dark gray, where it should be on.
Now, would you have done this way, or would you have, because you already painted it, or would you have done it?
I mean, it never occurred to me until today to paint an empty coffee can. So that's a good question. Like if I was going to put this in a still life.
Only because I have like, the cup that I have has like a lot of dimples. So I don't know if.
I mean, to be honest with you, Diane, I would ignore the dimples.
Okay.
If you really wanted to, okay, I'd have to look at that again. That's a really interesting question about that challenge. I mean, I think, just in a very simple way of putting it is I think what you would be doing, right now I'm painting one reflective surface, right? Mm-hmm. If you would actually paint all of those dimples, you would be painting hundreds of reflective surfaces. Okay. Because each of those dimples are creating a series of planes that are facing different objects.
All right.
The way I'm saying is makes it a little bit more complicated than it would be. But I don't know, Diane, I think my first, the first thing I would do would be to just paint that as if it didn't have those dimples on it.
Okay.
Okay. So, so I've blocked in a kind of simple, plane. So that stripe is in effect a plane that's turned under. And then the plane below that is turned up is altogether lighter. So I'm gonna paint that in simply as just a light plane. And I would refine this, now that I'm doing it, I think this is the way I would do it.
Yeah, it looks good.
I would paint the bottom, I would paint like the base, and then I would paint the planes cutting through that base. And so then now I have that simple dark stripe, simple light stripe. And then I'm going to look at variations within those things. So the most prominent variation I'm going to pay attention to is I see, first of all, there's a little oval of dark in the center of that reflection there. Highlight there. And I'll just go in and refine it a little bit. And one thing I will be sure to do is, so that it makes sense, I'm going to go in and alter the contour so that the contour clearly shows where so I'm going to show that little divot of that plane in there, if that makes sense. So I'm starting to add the details of of the coffee can. So you can see evidence of that groove on the edge.
Mm.
But basically the approach is just, again, so I start with the big masses on the reflective surfaces. And then I would, if I'm going to add another reflective surface, if I'm going to add the grooves, I'm going to start by just adding those large masses. I need to clean this up and refine it a little bit. And part of what I mean by reflections are a little bit more forgiving is that, you know, I don't know if you can see it, on this side of that groove, I see quite a bit of variation in there. So different things reflected on the underside of that groove. But if I don't paint every single one of those little variations, it's not going to be noticeable for a viewer. You know what I mean? In fact, this very simple dark plane is almost enough. Now there's a lot more information in there. But I can get away with not having to paint every little thing. So now the other thing that happens with those grooves is I'm no longer looking at straight stripes of highlight, but for example, this highlight comes down straight and there's actually like 2 lines on it. And then that highlight cuts under and follows the groove. That's that. And then it cuts back as it follows the top plane of the groove and then meets up again with the highlight below it, or the continuation of that highlight. And the same is true for this highlight. So this highlight actually, for whatever reason, ends at the top edge of the groove. And then on the top plane of that groove, or the up-facing plane of that groove, that highlight shifts left a little bit before picking up again parallel to the top groove. And so this highlight completely stops. That highlight's relatively soft, I think. Something like that. But then, so the highlight is altered by those grooves. So this highlight above the groove is soft, but then the highlight on the up-facing plane of the groove right here is very intense and very sharp, because it must be facing the plane of the light source more squarely, or it's more square to the direction of the light coming in. So this highlight here the paint underneath is a little bit too wet. I'm not going to be able to quite make it work. But this is a little bit bright. This is just a little bit brighter and a little bit sharper. And then we go again to slightly more diffuse highlight. And I would just continue that all the way down. Does that make sense?
Looks good.
So again, I would just continue refining, adding the information I think it needs to read clearly as a reflective object. You don't make yourself go crazy and think you have to put every little thing in there. You got to put in what makes it work. Okay. And so I would just keep going in that same approach. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I have a question, Professor.
Sure.
Because yeah, like the approach and the technique is really helpful. But the question is, if I'm draping a piece of fabric behind glass, like you are, when you first laid out the color mask, you kind of just left it like a flat color. Did you do that for time purposes, just for the demonstration? Because would you like fill in the drapery first with all the correct value, with all the highlights and shadows first, and then do the glass?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I left it blank first and then filled it in was I basically just changed my mind. I realized in the process of making the painting that a better way to do it would be to paint the background in and then paint on top of it. So yeah, I would, if you have a glass sitting on a draped surface like I do, I would rough in the drapery behind it and then start painting into that. The way the glass alters the way you perceive the drapery behind it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. That's the way I would approach it. Are there any other questions about it?
Professor, so do you look at my another painting about, with the pumpkin?
Yes.
So, yeah, so like that one, pumpkin, because some stripes just like this can, and I finished pumpkin and then paint the stripes later, right?
Yeah, you can do that. I think that came out very beautifully, by the way. You can paint. So what you did was you painted the green of the pumpkin, and then you painted the stripes on top of it, and showed the way those stripes changed with light and shadow, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a perfectly good way to do it. I mean, I have seen some artists, you know, paint like the green and the white of the stripes at the same time. I think that's a harder way to do it. I would do it the way you did it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, okay, I think I'm going to end the demo here, unless there are any other questions. And tomorrow will be asynchronous. Okay, so you should use tomorrow to work on your still life. Again, anyone, please contact me if you need any advice as you're working on it. You know, and contact me over the weekend. That's fine. And I'm happy to answer any other questions.
So this one is a D122, right? So, Professor?
Yeah, these can all be done. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, get as much, look, this doesn't, just like in my studio classes, if someone doesn't get this absolutely finished, I don't take away your grade. I don't deduct from your grade. Get as much done as you can. You know,
Okay.
put in, I'm expecting people to put in a serious, you know, 3.5 hour effort on studio days, you know, whenever you have time to do that. But if you're struggling with it and it's not totally finished, that's okay. Get as much done as you can. And,
Okay.
but again, just like I said, I mentioned, and maybe I should mention this again. I want to really emphasize that an important part of what we're studying is light and shadow. So please pay careful attention. Hold on, let me pull this up this way. So make sure you are lighting your objects so you get this clarity of light and shadow, right? You want clear light masses, dark masses. You want that clarity. For people who are painting draperies,
Oh, you know what I forgot to ask you? You said something about scaling the picture.
okay, I'll go over that. So let me just finish this one thought. If you're painting draperies, make sure that your drapery has this same clarity of light and dark. So you really
Are you showing something? Are you showing something?
Oh, sorry. Yes, screen share. So if you want to make sure that your objects have this kind of clarity of light and shadow. So you want to make sure you're illuminating your objects so you get this kind of clarity of light and shadow. And you want to make sure you're really finding that clarity of light and shadow. So if you're painting a drapery, you want to have this kind of clarity of light mass, dark mass, core of the shadow, reflected light, and so on. That's a really strong emphasis on this class. So just no matter how complex your objects get, you want to make sure that you maintain that light and shadow. You know, obviously the light and shadow on glass or metal is different, but on other objects, you want to make sure you have a clear light and dark situation. Okay, so let's go back to Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Let me see something.
Professor, I'm gonna try and hand everything into you by Tuesday, okay?
I'm sorry?
I said I'm gonna try and have everything for you for Tuesday.
Okay. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I doubt I'll get anything done after that.
I understand. Okay, so you want, okay, so in terms, you want to be, when you're studying your composition, you want to be working on a surface that's the same scale as the original painting. So the same way this copy is the same scale as the original painting. Okay, so do people know how to do that? Like you have your printout of the painting. How do you determine a canvas size that is the same scale? In other words, the same proportion. How would you do it? How would you do it mathematically?
The same ratio.
Same ratio, right. Who said that?
Melody.
Melody. So if you know the painting is 4x8 and your canvas is 16 inches tall, how wide is that going to be?
8.
8, right. So because the width is half of the height.
I'm terrible at this.
So you want to make sure that the copy you're doing is the same ratio as the original painting. Okay, it's the same proportion. Now, if you have some trouble with that math, you can also do it this way. You can take your reproduction. So you print out a reproduction. So here's a printout of the Artemisia painting. And so any border has been cut off. And then this rectangle here is the canvas that you need to make the copy on. You can put your reproduction down in any one of the corners of your canvas like this. Just place it right on top of the canvas and then make a diagonal from corner to corner of the reproduction and extend that diagonal up to the top of your canvas. And then you drop a line straight down.
Okay.
And then this part of your canvas is exactly the same proportion as the painting. You can do it that way.
Okay.
Okay. And then you can either cut this off or just leave it blank. It doesn't matter. This also gives instructions on how to grid. So you can grid your reproduction and use that as a way to make it easier to place the shapes. And this gives you instructions on that. I can also show that on Monday. Does that answer your question, Diana?
Yes, the way you're saying it right now works for me because I'm terrible.
Yeah, that's the easiest way to do it.
All right.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
No, that was it.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I'll end the session, and tomorrow will be asynchronous, and I will see you all on Monday.
Bye.
Professor, I sent you an email.
Okay, I'll respond by email. Okay.
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 All right. Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye, Professor.
Yeah.